Another kind of 10-15 seconds to trickle in, but welcome all. We are gathered to celebrate tonight Madeline Donahue's exhibition, Funhouse, which opened at Praise Shadows Art Gallery. And we do still have more people to trickle in. I see our participant number going up and up and up, so I'll kind of give us a little bit of time for people to come on in. But I'm Ingrid Chen. I am the founder and CEO of Praise Shadows Art Gallery in Brookline, Massachusetts. And I'm really honored to have these two wonderful women on our panel tonight to speak about the exhibition Funhouse. And what I wanted to express first is just that we are in this moment as COVID is starting to, or as we're seeing the end of COVID, hopefully, so many of us who are mothers or have helped mothers or been a parent during this time, I think anyone who sees Madeline's work just understands very much immediately how much it resonates with us. And that's how I discovered Madeline as well. I went to see her studio last year and I thought her work was brilliant in terms of ceramics and drawings and paintings. And I was really honored to be able to include her in our exhibition in January of 2021. It was our first group exhibition. And we had a couple paintings and a ceramic, and the response to her work was just beautiful and overwhelming. We were really lucky to also connect with Michelle Millar Fisher at that time, who found Madeline's work really interesting. And since then, we've had this dialogue about her work. So I think everyone here tonight is excited to be able to be a part of this conversation. And in a little bit, I'll pass this over to Michelle. But first, I will introduce everybody that you are about to hear from. The artist here is Madeline Donahue. She lives and works in Brooklyn, New York. And Madeline was born in Houston, Texas in 1983, where she regularly visited the Menil Collection. She was inspired by its Surrealist and Modernist collection, which remains influential to her today. She received her MFA at Brooklyn College in 2018 after beginning the program in the company of her 6-week-old daughter. She received her BFA from SMFA at Tufts, and many of her academic classes took place at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. I also want to put in my little note here, which is that the gallery is 2 doors down from the ice cream shop, JP Licks, where Madeline scooped ice cream for many years throughout Boston, many locations of JP Licks. So it was just awesome to be able to like open her show and then get ice cream together at the place that she used to work. The show is up through May 23rd, and if you're in the Boston area, please do come and visit us. And with her tonight is Michelle Millar Fisher, a curator and architecture and design historian. She is at the MFA Boston, and she is also co-founder of Designing Motherhood. We will be sharing information about Michelle's work in our chat tonight. So I'm gonna just let them get to it, and I hope everyone has a great time. Thank you both.
Thank you for such a lovely introduction. It's so nice to be with everyone tonight. I can't see the familiar faces in the participant block, but I'd had a look through and it's really nice to see folks who I know and also to welcome people who I don't know. It's my absolute delight and honor to be with you, Madeline. I know you know how much I love your work, but it's really lovely to be able to talk about your work with you. Just a wee note on formatting for tonight. We'll talk for about 30 minutes, but there are people, I think, in the audience who will have questions for you. You should all feel very free to put your questions in the chat at any point throughout, and I'll keep an eye on it and I'll try and pull them in. But we'll certainly leave adequate time at the end of our conversation for a Q&A. I have a lot of questions ready as well, and we'll probably have about 55 minutes together. Madeline, you also have a copious amount of slides, like we are not going to go dry in terms of images here. Haley, thank you for being our slide advancer. And so I think we can transition to the PowerPoint just now if you're able to pop it up. And we'll look at some of the slides to start off with. From your installation at Praise Shadows, Madeline. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit just about, in these first couple of images, what people are going to see when they come into the gallery, just to set the scene.
Yes, So right at the window, when you walk by, there are daffodils, which aren't necessarily related to the larger body of work, but I'm always attracted to the yellow that pops at the beginning of spring, and I find that it's like a talisman of like hope for warmer weather, and especially throughout the last year, this spring has been especially beautiful. So I made these and just felt like they would be really special in the window and really welcome people into the space. So after you see the daffodils, you walk in the entrance. This is on the right side of the gallery, so this is maybe the more obvious wall you see as you walk in. We have a collection of ceramics on the table, some paintings along the wall, and then drawings. And then the focal point of the show is the painting Cabaret, which is on the left-hand side next to the title of the show. Yeah, and this is a really great, I love how you can see how the ceramics are kind of, there's a nice view that points to the painting. So yeah, it was really fun to do the install. And then the left side of the wall is more paintings and another ceramic. Yeah, and we have drawings, paintings, and ceramics mixed throughout the show.
And so I'm going to ask you to talk about, I mean, there are many images that we could alight upon, but the next one, Haley, if you can advance the slide just one, can you start sort of setting the scene in terms of the body of work that's at the gallery just now? This is quite sort of a linchpin work in terms of the themes of motherhood and many of the ideas that you're exploring in the exhibition. Can you talk a little bit about what we're looking at here and when you made it?
Yeah, so this piece is not in the show, but I included it here because it was the first drawing painting I did directly related to motherhood. It's an ink drawing I did 6 weeks into the birth of my first child, my daughter. The painting is based on a dream that my mom claimed to have had when she was pregnant with me, that I appeared as a golden baby in her dream before I was born, when she was pregnant with me. So throughout my pregnancy, she repeated this dream over and over and over again. And with your first child, it's like you don't have any idea what to expect. You don't know what to do. You don't know what you're feeling, especially the first few months. And actually, I found the first year is kind of this whole new universe you've stepped on. So this painting was, it's like a portrait of me in my bed with my daughter, but from the point of view of my mom's like premonition dream, which I thought was just kind of an interesting thing to like project onto my birth. And then the next slide is, so that was the first piece I made with my first child. This was the first piece I made with my second child. I drew this and built this at the end of my pregnancy with my son, my second pregnancy, and then I picked it up from the kiln like a week after he was born, which sounds ridiculous, but I just felt the need to acknowledge him through sculpture. So I made this piece called Jugglers. And this is it's a portrait of, or a characterization of me and him and my daughter with our dog balancing us. If you can tell, there are openings like this. The sculpture is freestanding, and so the dog is like needing attention, but also holding us up, which I feel like is a good. It's like in a way I'm every character in this piece. Like I'm desperate for love. My children are desperate for love. We're also nourishing each other and supporting each other. So those are the two pieces that I made, like the beginning of my motherhood experiences for both children. And
I love the way that the family life sort of punctuates your work in so many ways, like these very momentous moments, like the entry of a child into the world, but also, as we'll talk about in a second, the sort of time punctuation, the brackets of time that you have to work in, and the way that actually that becomes, in some senses, one of the parameters that you have for creating your work and creating singular pieces. We're going to look at a couple of slides that, Haley, if you can just pass through. One of the things that I loved when we we were chatting about what we would talk about this evening, you said that so often when you're in conversation, somebody would maybe come into the gallery to see a show of yours that is up, or a work of yours that is up, or maybe somebody's coming to bring a work of yours into their own collection. When people come into contact with what you're making, so often it elicits from them a story about their own motherhood or about their mothers. Can you talk a little bit about that? Are there stories that have stood out to you? Or can you tell us a little bit more about what it feels to kind of hold those stories, or to have other people bring their own experiences to the experiences that you're sharing in your work?
Yes, so this is actually, I think when I started making this work, some of the questions I had were, and also I think some of the ideas about motherhood and art is that nobody's going to care, and why does anybody want to see this work? And also there's an idea that people will say, oh, I'm not a parent, so I can't relate to the work. And actually what I've found is that people come to me with their stories, not always just with birth and children, and with motherhood, but with stories of like loss, with cancer. Some of the like hair stuff resonates with people who've had cancer, and people who've lost somebody or loved somebody or cared for somebody. So it's been a really interesting experience. But I've almost every time someone's collected a piece, they've told me a story about their mother. And I almost feel like they're too private to share, but they activate.
And you don't have to.
But it is this like it. I think it showed me that the work isn't about me. It's about my mother in a way, or it's about my children's in the future, about it's really about, I mean, I guess I am the mother, but in a way it took me out of the equation for myself, because I'm not my own mother. I don't know, that's maybe a little too.
Well, it reminds me of something else that you said, Madeline, and actually comes into the next question I was going to ask you, because part of your everyday life, part of your private life very obviously comes out in your work. And so how do you negotiate that boundary between the private and the public in your work? And I remember you saying at one point in time, an image of a child or a child sculpted in clay is different from like actually having access to my child or posting something on Instagram, for example. And so there was sort of a boundary line in terms of medium and also in terms of context. But how do you negotiate that privacy and public in your own life as you share it in your work?
So part of it is we have this ability to take a photo and instantly share it, and there's sometimes an impulse that's involved there, and with the work I'm taking that impulse and then maybe writing it into a joke and then presenting that as an art piece. So there's this level of disconnect between the impulse. So maybe it's more about the impulse is gone, and the impulse is put into the handling of the work. The work is made really quickly. I make these each, so that's like the pink drawing is an example of like a sketch. So I had this idea for roller coaster, and I just quickly wrote it on a note card. I have a drawer of note cards in the dining room, and I just quickly sketched it in the middle of the night so I wouldn't forget. And then I went back and painted it. And there's something that happens with the disconnect between the real person, the real idea, and the artwork. And I think that I am consciously thinking about protecting myself and my children in a way. And there are things that are important to me to protect. And I'm not sure that I've really isolated what that is, or maybe like if I put it to words, then it would become something else. But I feel comfortable. And I started all of this work representing my concept of the postpartum body, and then have gradually introduced the child or birth or breastfeeding into the images depending on what's happening. And more than thinking about any particular aspect of my own children, I'm really thinking about myself and my own experiences. And I feel like that's enough of a boundary where that protects them or gives them a certain amount of privacy that they wouldn't have if I was posting like an instant image of them on the internet. And I do think there's something about artwork where it's the thinking of the artist that separates it from from like a social media post. It's that like thought process that goes into it, the deliberation of it.
Yeah.
And I try to find, because a lot of motherhood can be really abject and humiliating, and I think it's similar with living in a body, in a culture like in our culture where I mean, I think most humans have felt humiliated more than they've probably felt good about themselves, because we have these pressures, societal pressures to be perfect and to be beautiful. And so I kind of realized after I'd had my daughter that all of these projections of like the concept of what happens to a woman's body after she gives birth, like the worthlessness I thought I should have felt wasn't there. I actually felt like very empowered. I was so surprised that I didn't know more about my body before I'd had children, and I couldn't believe that so much had been hidden from me about my own body, because it's just amazing, like what the human body is capable of and what the female body is capable of. I was just, it was like this, explosion. I just couldn't believe it. So I started making work that was poking fun of these ideas of the female form. And there are some sculptures later on in the slide presentation, one where I'm like tucking my breasts into my pants. At a certain point when you're breastfeeding, you feel like your breasts are just like floppy flabs of skin. And like making fun of that released that tension, like leaning into the humiliation of it, deactivated any of those worthless feelings that I feel like I was kind of taught to feel about myself, no matter what I was projecting. It's like I was always supposed to feel kind of worthless. And I mean, that sounds a little dramatic, but it's the same with the images of the children. Anytime something really stressful or demeaning happens as a parent, I just kind of think about it as a piece of art. So, for example, I haven't gone to the bathroom by myself in 5 years, and it's not bad. Like it's weird and it can be exhausting and overwhelming, but at the same time, it's this moment where your children want to love you. It's so and because you're using the bathroom. And so this piece came out of that just realization that this was like 100% a reality of my experiences of motherhood that I hadn't seen. And
I think that's the point. That I think is really the point, that it's less that the notion of being given a hug while you're pooping is a terrible thing, and more so that is not seen as something that can be mined for the visual, for the creative, that can be reflected upon, and that has value. As Ing saying, the work is so super real. It is. And actually the comment above, I think it's Iona, we have our bodies ourselves coming up. So you're so right, like that sort of self-help and DIY literature very much part of this generation. I think we also have coming up in 2 slides from now, I think, some of the work. So Madeline, and here we go. Yeah, this is perfect. Judy Gellis. So Madeline, when I saw your work for the first time, I had this flood of different images in my mind from some of the picture research that we've done with my amazing colleagues, Amber Wornick and Juliana Botten and Zoe Greggs for Designing Motherhood. And Judy Gellis late Judy Gellis was a fantastic photographer based in Philadelphia, just on the outskirts of Philadelphia. And I couldn't help but think of this particular photograph, which comes from a series of hers that's in several collections, among them in the Philadelphia Academy of Fine Arts. And she did a series of images from the late 70s to the early 80s when her two boys were really young, called Family Portraits. And she, for her, there was this real need to be able to share what she was thinking and doing and feeling, and the subject material that she had in hand. And so, yeah, when I was thinking about your work in general, but actually so perfectly the work with you seated on the toilet, Judy Gellis very much came to mind. I wanted to ask, as we're looking through these images, and now that we've seen a couple, a good sort of 20 or 30 of yours, can you talk a little bit about the different media that you work in, and when and how you choose to employ those different media? Is one always the starting point, or does it differ depending on the day or the reason for making?
Right, so this work started with painting. My focus for the past 20 years has been on painting. At the museum school, it was difficult to paint, so I had a lot of other experiences. I screen printed for a long time. I kind of did a little bit of everything. There was a lot of like conceptual practice stuff going on. So I have a background, a really like broad background in a lot of materials, mediums. So I came to this work as a painter, and as my daughter was born, it's, you know, you can't paint with oils at home. So I would draw at home after she went to bed. I'd go back to my studio, paint from those drawings. My focus was working against any reference materials. So all of the work is just made from, I got to a point where I trusted my brain, and I, you know, had 30 years of drawing and painting experience. I could paint whatever I wanted to without looking at it. So the work, everything is made in a day. So when I went back to the studio, I would finish a painting that afternoon. If I had 2 hours, it would be a 2-hour painting. If I had 10 hours, I'd make a 10-hour painting. And that's still my practice today. And I started doing the sculptures in grad school at Brooklyn College. I had access to a kiln there. So this summer between my first and second years of grad school, I was in Maine with my mother-in-law, who is a ceramic artist. She makes functional work. She always has clay. Everywhere we go, she takes clay with her. So we were building with clay in Maine. I'd had experience working with clay in high school and in college, but I've never considered myself a sculptor. So it didn't really have any weight. And for some reason, just the change in my practice with a baby, my daughter was a year old, gave me the energy or freedom or whatever it was to start building with clay. So after that, I was still in grad school. I sought out ceramic classes at school and began making work there. And then that's where this whole drawing, painting, ceramic body of work came from. The drawings I mostly do at home at night. And then the painting I do in my painting studio, the ceramics I do whenever I can find a kiln. I bought a kiln. We quarantined in Connecticut for the first 6 months of COVID, and I bought a kiln and made a majority of this work that we're looking at there. And I luckily have had a residency, at least one residency every year for the past 3 years, where I make a bulk of the work that I show for the rest of the year. Yeah. So.
And then can I go back just a couple of slides, Haley, because I love the connection that you made between this work just here. Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you. And then the images that you have directly after it. Can you talk a little bit about that juxtaposition, Madeline?
Right. So this image on the far right is a friend of mine from high school. This was his class picture. So I had this idea in the back of my mind for the last 20 years. And then these are football players. The previous image is of the ceramic I made. So one of the early breastfeeding positions you're taught at the hospital is the football hold, and it's a hold you're taught for problematic nursing and for like relieving. A lot of people think that you hold a baby in a chair when you breastfeed, and the football hold is another position that that you're taught early on, especially if you have any issues feeding, like if there's any kind of blockage. And I just thought it was so funny that I'd had this image of my friend in my head for 20 years, and I'd been living with football my whole life. I mean, I don't watch it, but it's just there. And then there's this very important breastfeeding position that comes out of nowhere that you've never heard of until you need it. And it's also just a great, I guess, image, like just the way of, it's also, there's so many images of Madonna and child where the mother and child are being held in very casual ways, like the way you might hold your kid when you're getting out of the car.
Mhm.
But I am interested in depicting motherhood from all different angles that show maybe a more realistic aspect of motherhood. So also the first ceramic we saw, Jugglers, that is referencing sidelining, which is another kind of life-saving way to breastfeed, which a lot of mothers in the United States are discouraged from doing because you're not supposed to have your baby in bed. But if you have any kind of complications during the birth, it can really like save your life or really keep you breastfeeding.
And that's when you're lying prone on a bed or on a surface and you're able to have your baby nurse beside you without really having to hold them in any awkward position or any position at all, really.
Yeah, and there's a really great Paula Modson-Becker painting of her sidelining her baby, which of course I forgot to include here. But yes, it's especially the whole sidelining thing is especially important to me because I have friends who've been discouraged from having their baby in bed with them, and the hospital can be so threatening that they won't even lie in bed with their baby for a minute because they feel like they're going to be in trouble if they do, and somebody's going to come and take their baby away. And for me, I broke my tailbone when my kids were born, so I had to lay down. Like it was just the way to do it. And yeah, it also just looks better. Oh, if we go forward a little bit too, there's a sculpture called Lunch in the Grass that references the Manet painting, and that's also an example of sidelining, which during COVID we would have picnics outside on a blanket.
And we're looking at here. So I'm going to say two things here, Madeline. I'm going to say anyone in the audience who's thinking about asking questions, now is a really good time to get those juices flowing. We'll come to an audience Q&A in about 5 minutes or so. But you're also very, very welcome to put them in the chat if you would like just now. And then I have a few more questions. I'll save a few of them just in case we want to come back to them after audience Q&A. I'd love actually, these next few images are some of my absolute favorites of your work, Madeline, and it's difficult to pick favorites. It is like picking amongst children. But here we're looking at ultrasound. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the next couple of images and sort of set them in context.
Yes. Okay, so this is birth. So during COVID, I had all of this time to make work, which is that's a ridiculous thing to say because I didn't have that much time. But I had a kiln. I had all of the access to a kiln I could possibly want, so I made all these sculptures at night after my kids went to sleep, and because I had that unlimited access, I started to think about what I saw in my work and what I wanted to say with my work, what was maybe missing. So I created pieces about pregnancy, about birth, about my current experiences with my kids during COVID. So this is birth, and this is my son being born with the help of my daughter, which she wasn't there. She didn't help him be born. But with the birth of my son, I just kept thinking of her. She was ever present. I had to leave her behind. I had to leave her with a friend who we trusted, but it's even more than the first birth. It wasn't really about me at all. It was about this person that I loved so much, and then also, you know, introducing a new person and how to visualize that. So this is this work. The previous drawing, ultrasound, as I was pregnant with my second son, I didn't have a lot of childcare, so I took my daughter to all of my doctor's appointments, and and which can be pretty awkward when you're pregnant. And so this is an image about that, and it's referencing a Nicole Eisenman painting, which I couldn't find an image called The Gynecologist, where she painted a picture of herself at the gynecologist, and it looks almost like the gynecologist is like going down on her or something, but it's like it's a conversation about the experiences we have as women, and I created this image in reference to that from my experiences. And then the next few images are pieces that are related to pregnancy and birth. This is Ring of Fire, which is the name for that like feeling of pain as the baby is being born. And then the next, I don't know that, right? So these are images.
Yeah, these are some of the things when I was looking at this sort of area of the images that you'd collected, Madeline, someone already so rightly talked about Our Bodies Ourselves, which came into being in 1969, 1970 in Boston, when a group of women identifying people got together and said, which doctors do we trust? How can we share information? As you just mentioned, in terms of the Eisenman painting, the experience of going to a gynecologist was not always particularly fun, or empowered, or trauma informed, or thoughtful in terms of the patient. It was much more centered around the ease of the provider. And so, long story short, a lot of people know this book probably, but the women got together and decided to put together information that was not readily available on everything from contraception and abortion to what to do when somebody was experiencing domestic violence, to what happened during birth, images of birth happening in both homes and hospitals. And certainly that imagery then informed Carmen Winant's work. And I remember being at MoMA when Lucy Gallen did her really fantastic new photography exhibition that had Carmen's work in it, where she had the My Birth installation, where she took, I don't know, probably about 2,000 images of folks immediately during and post-labor, postpartum, yeah, very much showing images that had not been seen, or very rarely had been seen, in the hallowed halls of major museums. And then the next image is a little bit about or a couple of books that some of these will actually be on display in the Museum for the Designing Motherhood, but this is of that moment as well in Our Bodies Ourselves in the 1970s, where folks started writing about their own experiences of birth, particularly of home birth, when there was sort of a resurgence of the home birth movement at that time for folks who could make choices about where they wanted to give birth. So there was certainly social location involved in there, but yeah, it really reminded me this sort of moment in time that folks were exploring in the 1970s and early 1980s, and very much connected to some of the themes that I saw in your work. We're getting some really good questions in the chat, Madeline, and so actually I'm going to turn to some of them because I want to honor the great questions that are coming in. And so I'm going to go. Actually, Ing has a question that was on my list as well. And so I'm going to ask you that one first. So someone once asked Ing, if you, Madeline, are really funny in person, since your work is full of humor, how would you respond to that? And I'd love you to talk about the humor and then the humiliation, because I think those two things go hand in hand. And you talked really beautifully the last time we were chatting about the kind of the abject and about death as well, and how comedy and humor is interpolated with that. So yeah, I'll hand it over to you for that question.
Yeah, so I think I isolated that this work is about it's about joy, humor, and the abject. And I am a very silly person. I don't know if I'm hilarious, but I do love humor. I love funny people. I'm happiest when I'm with somebody who I can just riff off of. It's biggest joy ever. I grew up around a lot of funny people. I grew up around a bunch of people who are now professional comedians. I'm Irish American, which my Irish family is hilarious. Lots of, you can say anything as long as it's a joke. You can say anything to anyone. I love humor, and I do this work comes from. I've experienced death, and it's very real. It's very difficult. And I think humor is a way to cope. And also, I think my experiences with death have made my experiences as a parent all the more precious and joyful and funny. Yeah. And I, it's like I've heard conversations with parents who feel, it's like you anticipate everything that could happen. Every day is like a second of anticipating death. And I get that sometimes. And then I immediately start making fun of myself for that seriousness. So right. So I think that the work, there's something that, like, one of the criticisms of women and women who maybe love is that it's too saccharine like mom blog culture. There's a lot of like demeaning of women and women's experiences. And I feel like my connection to death and perhaps life experiences and humor keeps something, there's something about the work that is rooted in that like keeps it from being too saccharine. And I think there's like I work against nostalgia. I think there's like nostalgia is really strong in other, like can work in other art forms. But for some reason for me in this work, it's not about reminiscing on the past. It's about being completely present with the current moment, and recognizing that it's fleeting and that's scary and that's sad. But it allows room for me to be joyful about it. And also I think that also, I mean, art history is like, there's not a lot of room for female joy in art history. So that's kind of exciting.
Totally.
Yeah.
As an art historian, that's what makes me very excited, Madeline. I think there is sort of an efflorescence. I don't want to say a moment, because there's definitely precedent for thinking about motherhood, about female joy, about subverting canonical expectations of what it means to be an artist. But I do think over the last couple of years, I've seen a real efflorescence of artists, whether it's Carmen's work, whether it's Heiji Shin at the Biennial and her beautiful photographs of babies emerging from the womb, whether it's Maggie Nelson writing The Argonauts, lots of Jessica Friedman, a young Australian author, writing about in a book everyone should read called Things That Helped, which she wrote about the experience of having her son and then having postpartum depression. There's this efflorescence of folks who are, and very logistical things actually, like, or very prosaic things, like the New York Times now has a parenting section since 2019. So there is an efflorescence of people having these conversations. But I think you're absolutely right in that, I mean, I often get asked, and so does Amber, my co-writer, why Designing Motherhood never happened at any of the museums at which I work, or why it was so difficult to get it on, to realize it as a project. It's been some years now before it's finally coming out. And our answer has always been the people who make decisions, who are museum directors, who are museum chief curators, who are people who have publishing funds or greenlight other types of resources, are almost universally either people who haven't lactated or haven't had to be primary caregivers, or haven't had to in some way give over their body or their mind to the experience of mothering, of parenthood, of however they come to identify with it. And so, yes, I just want to affirm what you said, because it really is one of the many touch points in your work that makes me so deeply excited about it, because it does make room for subjects and subjecthood and joy around that subjecthood that I feel has not been missing necessarily. It's just under-recognized and under-resourced and under-told, which is why I'm really glad there's a very fierce woman-run gallerist like Ing saying, let us make space for this kind of exhibition. There's some great comments that are coming through. So Stephanie really loved the football hold, symbolic of strength, but also holding a child, and nursing is feminine and tender. So motherhood is both strong and tender, absolutely. Erin has a really nice question and comment. They ask, how does your imagery come to you, as dreams, memories, symbolic or surreal imaginings? Do you jot them down as they come to you, or do you quick sketch them? And they also say, also, thank you so much as a fellow mom for talking about leaning into the humiliation part of things. So yeah, can you tell a little bit more, talk a little bit more about how your imagery comes to you?
Right, so the imagery, it's like an impulse. Like I'll have an image, and it's like the harder the day is, the more likely that I'm gonna have like a concept of how to express it, and so I'll just have kind of an impulse, and I'll just quickly jot it down. And I have a drawer in my dining room where I keep cards, and I just have I have a very organized like drawing system. I have a book and a sketchbook, and I have pencils and markers, and it's just very organized. So at any moment, if I have an impulse to draw, I can do it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then I it's like I'll have an idea, and maybe it's the more I can work consecutively, the more quickly ideas come. So it's really having the time to work and making work, and then each painting, each piece. So these sweaters are a good example. These pieces I made when I was in that stage of breastfeeding, where it just feels like your breasts are like just like flat tires, you know, fluffing around. And then that evolved into Running Back, which is the more thought out piece, breastfeeding with my daughter in the sweater. Yeah. So it's like I make room for those impulses, and then I get them down so I don't forget them. This is the piece where this is called Nip Tuck, where I'm like tucking my breasts into my pants.
Andrew's saying in the chat, we want to see the drawer. I don't know if you're close to your daughter. Look at your
But maybe we can share it on Instagram. Yeah.
I was gonna say maybe that's a post for after the chat. It's I want to see it too, Andrew. Rebecca has this really thoughtful observation or question that I'm going to share. So they're saying that often you are solo or alone in the work as a mother, and they're not observing a partner or co-parent or a support system. Is that significant? Is that a choice? Could you speak a little bit to that?
Yes. So I am trying not to tell anybody else's story. This work is about my perspective, and this work is not about my partner. It's about my experiences, and came from the shock of childbirth and child rearing. And also, I am by myself most of the time taking care of my kids. I haven't really had childcare throughout my experiences as a mother. My daughter's in school now, and we've had some people help out here and there, but for the most part, I've been on my own. And so it is kind of an honest reflection of you know, of my experiences. The other thing is I have painted my husband so many times that he doesn't feel left out in the work, and he also doesn't have an ego about it. He doesn't feel like he's missing from it. I also feel like the work is about intimacy. That's really the root of, I think, my lifelong interest in making work is it comes from intimacy. And my intimacy with my husband is a completely different story. I don't know that intimacy has anything to do with our relationship as parents. It's more of a team. So yeah, I just am letting myself have this time to focus on my perspective, basically.
I love that idea of different forms of intimacy, Madeline. I'm also really loving, thank you to everybody, and please keep them coming if you have others to the questions, which would be absolutely fantastic. I have another one here from Stephanie before I go back to some of mine. And she says, Madeline, you mentioned you hadn't considered yourself as a sculptor. Do you feel differently now? Do you think you will explore using other materials in the future? And she also shares out from a fellow Texan. So hi to Stephanie, I don't know if you're in Texas just now, but thank you for the great question. I hand it to Madeline.
Yeah, that is a great question. I think I do feel like a sculptor now. And it is really empowering to work with a new, I love how awkward my ceramics are. And I love the naivete of that. And I do, yeah, it is really fun. I do feel like a sculptor now, and I've had more thoughts about new ways to work, and also ways to make my paintings more sculptural. And it's frustrating to not be able to make ceramics in Brooklyn at a whim. I've fortunately had the last 2 months at Art Shack to be able to make whatever I want to make, but it's just, it feels like, you know, having your hands tied behind your back. You have all this energy to make something and you have to wait for somebody else to help you do it. That's frustrating. But I've been dreaming of like other sculptural materials to use that I can keep this work going without any restrictions. And also just trying to figure out how to have my own kiln here in Brooklyn. Yeah, yes. Long answer.
All good answers though. And Christelle has a really lovely observation that I'll share before I ask another couple of questions. They're saying so many of your figures poses are so tightly charged and choreographed. And I do think that's really true. Actually, it's such a lovely observation because you fit so much in, and there's often interlocking or kind of overlapping which again comes back to this really wonderful way to visualize different types of intimacies and touching and what it is to often be with children, especially young children. And they're saying, as a mother of a wild gaggle of kids myself, I know each of these crazy multitasking poses well, and I love too that you're taking this fairness and truth out of the private realm and sharing it so explicitly. And then Alison, I don't know where you're based, but Alison is saying, come over and use my kiln if you would like to. Actually, Alison sets me up for a really nice question, which was on my list. Who do you think of as your peers, and who are you looking to when you're creating work? And we're actually seeing some of these really nice reference images that you have coming up on the screen, but I always love to ask an artist, like, who's in your immediate microcosm and milieu, who you look to, who you have friendships with, who you might be sharing kilns with, or other types of material or conceptual materials. And then who are the artists who really were like epiphany moments or really meant something to you or still do?
Right, so I'm gonna have to say Alison is a peer, because also I didn't know you had a kiln, Alison. So the artist I'm working directly around in New York, Rose Nestler is a sculptor, a friend of mine. We went to Brooklyn College together. Danny Orchard is a painter. Her work is different. She's not a parent. Neither Rose or Danny are parents, but most of my peers are not parents here, but I love their practice, the veracity of their practice. And Jenna Gribben is an incredible peer and just inspiration. She's another painter. She's also a mother. She's always made me feel like one of a team, instead of she's always been like out as a mom, and really proud of it. Yeah, I feel like most of my peers here are painters, and like Lou Fertino, we're not like friends, but I just feel so inspired by his work, and just the beauty of his surfaces and his paintings are just incredible. And then as far as the artists that I feel inspired by, I like to look at artists who have practices that aren't like out of this world, like artists who've made a living and have a really inspirational practice, but aren't like superheroes, like aren't like crazy famous, and where they might still make their own work. I love Kathy Bradford. She's like a goddess to everyone in I feel like working artist these days. And Derek Adams is also a really inspirational artist. He's a human being who also is a really talented and successful artist. I love Francesca De Matteo. She is a ceramic artist. She kind of fuses function and fine art. And she has kids, and she has this incredible studio life where she has a studio at home, and her kids are a completely integral part of her life. And that's really inspirational. Yeah, there's so many artists. And then obviously like Betty Woodman is a great like ceramic hero. Just for her vision. There's not a lot of work that ceramics has been around forever, and there are tons of artists who do incredible work with clay. And there's also a lot of room for innovation. So she is one of the really incredible like innovators of clay.
Yeah, I was just at the fabric workshop actually on Friday. My lovely friend Karen Patterson is the very smart curator there, and as part of their current exhibitions, there's a lovely selection of Betty Woodman's work up. And I can look at it all day in a catalogue or in pictures, but when you're in the presence of it, it's just, the word that always comes to mind for me is exuberant, and then this sort of super experimentation, which makes me so happy to see. And as you say, in such an ancient medium, really pushes it in directions that were totally and utterly her own. There was an image of her work just a few slides back. So we have about 5 minutes or so left, Madeline. So if anyone has burning questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. We'll make sure that we get to them. I wanted to ask you a question that we sort of danced around, but I haven't asked you directly. And it came to me again when you were saying, you mentioned one of your peers and you said, and she's very much out as a mother. Can you tell us what it's a little bit like? And it's a very particular thing to go back to start an MFA 6 weeks postpartum. But what has it been like, both at sort of the beginning stages of an MFA, but also as you've come out and sort of started establishing yourself post MFA, and as an artist? Has motherhood as a subject, has intimacy as a subject, has the postpartum body as a subject? How has this work been received? Was it possible to have support and conversations both from faculty and peers when you were in your MFA, for example, around these subjects? And what have been both the sort of the long, wonderful ends and sometimes short and sharp ends of the stick in terms of having this subject matter as an artistic practice?
Right. So I got really lucky. At Brooklyn College, I was 6 weeks postpartum, really supportive community. I was drawing my maternal experience or my postpartum experiences, kind of hiding them, and then presenting other work and my crits, and my teachers saw the stuff I was kind of hiding and were like, this is actually way more interesting. And it took me some time, and just like I was making it, and I just kind of kept hiding it, and really encouraged to speak out of it, show it. And Chris Richards, actually, we had like maybe monthly visits where I would bring my daughter to school, and we would just talk about art and about like what my interests were. And so I had 2 years of encouragement as a grad student. And then immediately when I graduated, I showed at Underdonk, which is an artist-run space. Danny Orchard put me in a show, and she included my motherhood paintings and my sculptures, like work that was kind of both referencing the body and referencing motherhood. And it wasn't even discussed. It was just like, this is the work I like. Let's put it in a show. And I think that had a great impact on the way other people saw my work. She elevated it. She like activated that work, regardless of whether or not she knows that she did that. And then I met Kathy Bradford, and she is a mother, and she did a visit with me in grad school. She just was like, this is like, you have to share this with people, which was really, it's like, as an individual, you don't think that about yourself. And then to have somebody say that to you, it's like levels of activation. And I was lucky to meet a bunch of really incredible people. David Altmaid came in, and he just was like, oh my God, your sculptures are so cool. It was like he was like a little kid. It was amazing. It was just like, and I don't know, I've had a lot of really incredible experiences with really great people. And I just don't think about, for whatever reason, I don't care what people think, really. The thing that's driving me is to make work that I love, or work that I think is really weird. And I'm like, why did I make that? That's so weird. And then like I have, my interest is in having like a lifelong career as an artist. And so I try to follow my instincts in terms of like what pieces to make. And then I also just try to make a lot of work, so that I have work to show. I have work that appeals to somebody. And I've had a mix of like shows where I show pieces that have nothing to do with motherhood, and then like my show with Ing, where it's just my solo show in New York, the work was all about motherhood, and then this show with Ing. So my 2 solo shows have been both like an opportunity to really focus on the subject matter, which has been really great. And then group shows have just been like a mix of everything, which is also really exciting. So I feel very lucky.
There's a great question in the chat, which I'm going to get to before I ask one last one of my own. Ing has a lovely comment, which I think is worth reading. The very first visitor to Funhouse was a young man who worked at a store across the street, and your work provoked him. He said, this art makes me want to call my mother and tell her how much I appreciate her. And I do think exactly what you said, those levels of activation. I've been so lucky to have mentorship in my work in museums, but also just to have had peers who have said, you're not crazy, these are interesting ideas, or I'll read something of yours and respond to it. And those are such important things to have, because I think it does in some ways give you an armor where you can say, well, okay, I think it works, and other people who I respect have said they like it too, and so I'm just going to keep going, rather than, as you said earlier in the talk, listen to some of the messages that were told about everything from our bodies to the ways that we present ourselves in the world to the ways that we think and do and act.
Right.
So that,
I'm sorry, yeah, sorry.
No, go ahead, Madeline.
Just the idea of our bodies ourselves too is like, that book is definitely why I'm free to make this work. I think there's this idea that like, if you read about feminism and if you participate in feminism, then like you're going to have all the answers and you're going to be comfortable in the world. But I think the reality is like, you can have all of that information and it's going to take you to a different place. And so like, I grew up, my mom had, you know, her birth experiences she talked to about with us. And I was familiar with birth. It's not something that was a mystery to me. And I grew up with literature about my body and about feminism, but there was still so much like hidden from my experiences, and it really like made this interesting kind of like mental explosion that encouraged me, like all of that stuff gave me the confidence to pursue this stuff, pursue this work in an imperfect way, like without all the answers, and it's all just kind of like an exploration of like what I'm feeling at the time, and then how that evolves into the next place.
You're reminding me, I just looked it up actually, it's a quote that I used in the Designing Motherhood book, Madeline, but you're so right, having the information in your hands is one thing, but the poet Adrienne Rich, this is one of my favorite quotes ever, in 1975, she said, and I quote, "Women have often felt insane when cleaving to the truth of our experience. Our future depends on the sanity of each of us, and we have a profound stake beyond the personal in the project of describing our reality as candidly and fully as we can to each other." And I often think about that, because it's not just being able to hold our bodies ourselves, or whatever book it is about reproductive, pioneered by many women of color rather than the white women behind OBO, that helps us, but being able to say those things out loud. And I think that's what really moves me about your work, because it is those personal experiences, but when they add up, become a movement, or become something that is much more difficult to ignore when they are made public. I've two questions, maybe I've only have time for one, and so I'm going to prioritize the one that's in the chat. Alicia asks, what do your children think of your work?
So interestingly enough, my son, who's 1.5 years at our opening, walked in, and I think I was talking to somebody, and he showed them the artwork, which was really interesting. And then he kind of pointed himself out in different pieces, which was just really interesting because he's a baby. And my daughter is old enough now that I mean, she's grown up in the studio. She's just been like, you know, such a part of my practice for the past 4.5 years. And I'm for the past year, I've been talking to her about it. And, you know, asking her what her thoughts are. What does she see in the work? I try not to give her answers, but just listen to what she thinks about it. And I was listening to an interview with Chantal Jaffe recently, where she was talking about like kind of the problems of depicting your children in your work. And I am kind of aware of that. And I mean, very aware of like presenting my children to the public through photographs, like we talked. So, so it is like something that I have like an open conversation with her about. And so far she is really proud of it, and like really proud of my practice, which is so funny. Yeah. And especially going to the ceramic studio, where we've been going for the past 2 months, like she feels like she's part of it. Like she's part of the whole community of the ceramic studio, which is also really incredible.
Madeline, that's magic. That's just so, so, so beautiful. I feel, yeah, it's a really lovely sort of note to end it on, actually. you said it was funny in a way, and I know it's sort of a turn of phrase, but I find it so deeply meaningful and profound that you have that wonderful generational connection with your children in the studio. It's been a total pleasure to be your interlocutor over the last hour. And I'm really grateful to everyone who offered these really fantastic questions as well. If you haven't seen Madeline's exhibition, I haven't, so I will be going up. I'm currently in Philly, but I'll be going back up to Boston, and I will go see. So please come see. And Ing and Haley, thank you very much for having us in conversation tonight. Madeline, thank you. Within a webinar format, if you want to put your round of applause for Madeline in the chat, please do as you sign off. It was lovely to have everyone here. Madeline, I look forward to seeing you in person very soon. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, thanks.
Take care, everyone. Thank you. Thank you.